Welcome to this month's edition of All Politics is Local. As you've learned by now, we're having a conversation with the first select people of each of the communities within the Valley Shore district. It's the 9 towns. And I am graced with the company of Laura Francis today, the first select person. It's officially first select men in charter. I'm so comfortable calling it select woman, so I think we're going to wind up with Laura and Chris.
That's fine too.
But she is the first selectman of the beautiful, bucolic community of Durham. And I'll let her introduce herself and say whatever she'd like.
Yes, I'm Laura Francis, and I am the first selectman of the town of Durham. And I am, in November, will be completing my third 4-year term. That's
a tremendous commitment. We talked a little bit earlier about public service and how, in the estimation of my family, public servants are undervalued and underrespected. But what you have chosen to do from town clerk of Durham early on into running the community as much as any elected official runs anything, because eventually the community runs itself with all the volunteers and all the people that work within your beautiful town. But small-ish, 7,500 or so population, 26 point something square miles. You started as a town clerk at the same time I started as a fireman in a similar geographically sized town of Fairfield. So tell me what your experience was from having been the bride of a military man and military officer, I should say, and a mother, and then town elected official, and town clerk is a tremendous burden in many ways. So tell me about your early life in the community of Durham and what led you to sign up for that, please.
Well, I'm one of the lucky people who actually work in a field that I studied in college. Not everyone can say that. And so when I graduated, yes, my husband was in the military. That took us overseas for a few years. But when we came back to Connecticut after he got out of the Army, we wanted to live in a small town. He was from West Haven, I was from Hamden, two rival communities. Sure. in some ways.
So and neither of those was a choice.
Neither of those were an option. And I was home with a couple of babies and working as a direct sales consultant for a company that worked at the Durham Fair. So I went to the Durham Fair as a vendor. Sure. And fell in love. And I said to my husband, we were living in Manchester at the time, if you ever get a job that brings us closer to home, where our family still lived in West Haven, North Haven, Hampton, I want to live in Durham. And we were very, very lucky to have had that opportunity.
So specifically, because folks out there don't really understand that elected officials are just them with a title and having gone through that gauntlet of campaigning. So what was that first experience?
So the reason I wanted to move into Durham, because here I was watching this Durham Fair, this amazing event happen in a community that put this on. So I said, I want to live among these wonderful people that can throw a party like this.
There you go.
And so when I did move in, I got friendly with a neighbor and told her, you know, what I had done in college, etc. And the assistant town clerk's position came open. And she said, do you think you'd like this job? I said, I would love this job. But my son, he's 4 years old. I was hoping to go back to work when, both of my children were in college. He was my youngest. And she said, Laura, this person who is retiring was there for 32 years. If you don't take advantage of it now, you may not have another chance for a while.
More.
So I pulled some things together and applied. I was told by my family not to get my hopes up because it's a small town. They probably had somebody lined up already.
5th generation Durham.
Right. And was very, very, very appreciative that the town clerk gave me a shot.
So Tell us, because none of us know, and I have good friends who are town clerks. I have no real idea what the town clerk does. I know I've gone for documentation of my home's title. I've gone for information on vehicles and what have you. But I think people get confused about the town assessor, the town tax office, and the town clerk. So
the town clerk is the record keeper for the town. It keeps all of the town records from minutes, agendas, town proceedings. Also the Registrar of Vital Statistics. So if you are born in Durham, or if you marry in Durham, or if you pass in Durham, those records are kept in the town hall. And our records go back to 1699.
Wow.
But you know, more and more, the modern day town clerk, in addition to all of that, is a major communicator for the community. So after 5 years of being an assistant town clerk, my town clerk unfortunately passed away. I became the town clerk, and I was integral in bringing computers into the town hall and internet, and I helped build the first website.
Wow. I thought Al Gore invented that. That was you?
He helped me.
He helped.
Okay. He helped me. And so now a lot of town clerks around the state of Connecticut are very involved in managing the content on municipal websites, making sure that all of our records are up there. And it was funny in the beginning, you know, I was like, oh, we can't put that stuff on the internet because then it will be for free. And, you know, we can't charge for making copies. And I spent a lot of my early days, my beginning years, just making copies for everyone. And I said, well, if we put it out there, we won't have to make the copies. And we can do other things.
Well, interesting. We're going to get to this because as a first select person, you must always look at where revenue streams are coming from, as well as how you're going to make it more efficient. And those are not necessarily consistent. But there you are. And as someone who's had to maintain records for the periods of time required by the Secretary of State, required by Freedom of Information, I'm actually educated. I did not really realize that our town clerks across the state in 169 individual municipalities are maintaining records going back before the town was even founded in 1708. Mm-hmm. So almost a decade beforehand, someone is still, and we've all seen the documents, those old documents.
Handwritten.
Absolutely, but those are the purview of our town clerk.
Absolutely.
And so, and I have to ask.
And we're required to preserve them. So over the years, we have applied for grants to make sure that those records can survive.
I'm guessing some of your initiative in going digital was that having those boxes and buildings full of papers was not necessarily a good choice.
Well, we did it in two ways. First, we preserved the paper,
Yep.
and we had them specially treated so that the paper would not disintegrate. But then we did digitize so that we can, you know, also keep them that way.
Yeah. And so here you were, a young town clerk, assistant town clerk. I have to ask because attention must be paid, the name of the person that mentored you.
Marjorie Hatch.
Marjorie Hatch.
And she gave me the biggest gift of my professional career. And that is that she had me do everything that she did. And she involved me in, back then, and still do, town clerks in a county will get together to discuss business and share experiences, et cetera. And she would take me to those meetings. And therefore, I was able to know all of the surrounding town clerks. She afforded me every opportunity to get training, including international classes, et cetera. So that when she unfortunately passed away suddenly, I was able to step into her shoes.
Well, anybody watching that works for a community, that's a great message. Mentor your people because they may need to replace you, or none of us are going to live forever.
Yeah, government doesn't do, generally speaking, a good job of succession planning.
Well, I think it's because we worry and work so hard to gain those offices that some people who are not so inclined are afraid that if they give away those tools, they've lost their primacy. And obviously Marjorie Hatch didn't feel that way. So all of you watching, be Marjorie Hatch. With that, she gave you what I learned as you and I were talking at the beginning, a wonderful push towards something that now is a state resource. So tell us about establishing that community of town clerks.
So we had a great association, and I was also very fortunate to be able to get involved with the state association. And that's where I learned that even though some of us were elected representing parties, that gets shed away when we're working towards common goal and common interests. And when I made the leap to run for first selectman, I was a little afraid that I would lose that collegiality, and perhaps in that arena of chief elected officials, that I would have to maybe get more involved in politics or partisan politics than I did as town clerk. And as town clerk, you can't, because you're part of the election process. Mm-hmm. So while a political party may have helped you get elected to that position, as town clerk, you really had to step back. And I was afraid of that. But pleasantly surprised that even amongst the most partisan mayors and first selectmen out there, when we get together at meetings such as CCM legislative meetings or Council of Government meetings or other regional entities that we're part of, I have to this day, almost 12 years later, not have ever felt uncomfortable being in the company of, say, a big Democrat mayor. I'm a Republican, or had any problems, setting up regional efforts or being part of regional efforts because of politics. So I think the people should know that happens.
I think that's huge. We just had a conversation with both Democratic and Republican first select men and women and elected officials from the state, and the fact that dialogue continues at COG, at the Council of Governments, at the Council of Small Towns, COST, and at the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, CCM, is illuminating to people who watch television or get their information from social media, where it's easier to polarize, it's sexier to be on one side or another. And the reality is we are a nation made up, and your community made up, more of unregistered.
That's right.
Many of them think of themselves as independents, but there's a separate party for that. Right. And as an unregistered, you just don't get to vote in the primary in most communities. But they are the greater portion of our community in every city in the state and town. And so the fact that you early on were inculcated in that by Marjorie Hatch was a tremendous boon. I worked closely with Betsy Brown, as I mentioned, and also a nonpartisan person who puts town before herself and before her party, and you and the other folks that were here from various parties do the same. I have great admiration for the Valley's community for that reason. So you've been the town clerk, you've put yourself into the position, and everyone, including me, wants to know why you would step into that landmine. I mean, it's not a briar patch to Brer Rabbit, it is a briar patch. What led you to step into the first selectman's role?
Well, so as town clerk, the Durham Town Hall is a very small building. We have very few employees. Mm-hmm. And so I had the opportunity to get involved with different subject matters. And as someone recently told me, I have, and I'm not so sure it was a compliment or not, but someone told me I have an insatiable desire to know how things work, and I am truly fascinated by a number of different topics.
Well, that would be a compliment to me.
And as diverse as the town clerk's office was, mm-hmm. I noticed that I was starting to pay more attention on how things operated in public works and how things operated in public safety, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just did it.
Well, it goes to your education. Whatever it was that led you in Providence to say, I want to study political science and government administration, that speaks to something greater than record keeping, as important as record keeping is in this Constitution state. Governance, It's a little like control. There's a line in Ordinary People where Judd Hirsch asks Tim Hutton, what are you here for? And he says, control. And Hirsch just looks and says, that'll take a little longer. And that's true in government. We see today, trying to balance the state budget, the federal issues, and your local issues.
Well, another thing everyone should know is that as first selectman and even as mayor, there are very few decisions we could make independently. Just about everything that I do or have purview over has multi-levels of approval process that we have to do. Now, can I set an agenda? Yes. But can I control everything? No.
Well, you're the skipper of the ship.
Right.
And you do set where the tiller is placed and which sails you've got up.
Right.
But the wind, the tide, the waves, the other vessels all will impact what your path is.
And as it should be.
Indeed, indeed. It is a public service. And although folks forget that Jack Welch was also a servant, he had to serve his corporate board, he had to serve his investors, he had to serve his customers. If they weren't selling light bulbs, who were his customers? Right. So in dealing with young people, I'm always reminding them that we're called to serve.
Right.
And whether you're religious or not in this season of Easter, it's important to remember that sacrifice that we remember this time of year is made voluntarily. Right. And is made by people like you who step up, and I'm eternally grateful.
Thank you.
So having said all that, tell me what surprised you as a student in college studying political science and governmental affairs, walking into the selectman's office, and taking over. Was it that you didn't have as much control as you expected?
No, it wasn't that, but I was a little surprised on how many different already established organizations that first selectmen and mayors are required to have representation on, whether it is the Regional Transit Authority, whether it's at the Workforce Development Board, whether or not it's at the Middlesex County Revitalization Committee. All of a sudden my email box got flooded with, oh, are you coming, are you coming, are you coming? I'm like, what do you mean? Well, Durham's a member of this and you have representation on this. So I was a little bit surprised at the level of outward attention that I needed to spend.
Outside of the boundaries of Durham.
Outside of the boundaries of Durham and outside of the office. And to this day I struggle with that. You know, I know that I need to get out into the state, to attend these meetings, to go to those trainings in order to bring back those little nuggets back to Durham. But every time I'm not sitting in the office when someone might come by to find me, you know, that's a struggle for me.
Right, and to that point, you, as one of the smallest communities with some of the smallest resources available in terms of staff, can't just delegate to 12 other people.
I tell my mayor friends all that time, I said, you know, we have the same job, but you have people.
That's right, you don't have people. You need people.
I have great staff.
Of course.
At the town hall, but
their tasks are already full.
They're one man deep or one woman deep.
Yep.
It's not that, you know, I have full departments.
Right, and even we spoke briefly about volunteerism. You've got volunteer fire services. You've got a volunteer chief who became your third select person for your first term.
Yep.
And I think about the commitments being made. I'm a retired fireman, and here I am back at work in a variety of places because we have great desire to contribute. You have those people in your community.
We do.
And obviously you've learned, and the Durham Fair, which we'll get to, has learned to draw those resources. That's how you commit to a national enterprise that is, nationally recognized premier enterprise with a town of 75-something hundred. So there you are, and you're having to go to this organizational meeting, that transportation meeting, and then an emergency happens, and you also need to be available on that speakerphone for the governor's emergency operations center activation and how you're going to manage a nor'easter or a hurricane or an ice storm or any number of things. I was involved in developing those exercises. And I don't just mean for the actual event, but to exercise your resources for
That's
the
right.
event.
That's right.
And so there is a period of time that you're locked in a room with your speakerphone on and having to input on Everbridge all of the data.
So
how do you do that?
So speaking of Everbridge,
Yep.
we were one of the first 3 towns to be Everbridge customers.
How did that happen?
My emergency management director and I went to a conference, and we learned about these reverse 911, and that's not the proper verbiage because
that's a brand name, but it's
a
still,
brand name.
everybody
It's a
knows
brand
it is
name,
that. It's
but
like
everybody
Xerox
knows
copies.
like reverse 911, and we said, well, I wonder if that's something that would be, good for Durham. And so we looked at a number of different products. Everbridge was not the cheapest, but it had the most functionality. And I knew some people in New Haven and looked at it, and they were using it very appropriately and widely. And we convinced the town that even though it was a little bit more money, we should go with this route. And it was the wisest decision that we ever made. And because now the whole state of Connecticut uses it because it's that good of a product. And and so I convinced our board that we needed to have a tool to notify our people of an emergency. But in fact, the first time that I used it was to notify people that they were safe. When the explosion happened in Middletown, we felt that in Durham. In fact, in my house, it was a Saturday, and my husband was upstairs, I was downstairs, we heard a big boom. I thought he fell. He came running downstairs, he thought I fell. Then we said, oh no, a tree must have fallen on our house. That's how badly we felt that explosion in Durham. The 911 circuit boards were overrun, and because we have mutual aid service to Middletown, our fire chief was one of the first on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
He contacted back to us and said that was the explosion. So I used the notification system to tell everyone that it was an explosion in Middletown and Durham is safe and there's no damage in Durham. And it was very impactful because in Middlefield, it also was felt.
Oh, yeah.
And so a daughter called her mother in Durham from Middlefield and said, Mom, are you all right? We heard this big noise. And she said, don't worry, Laura called, it's fine, we're safe.
You pulled off the 911 system, that one phone call at least, and probably a lot like that. And I'll tell you, in Guilford, on my back deck, our windows rattled.
Yeah.
I called immediately, because I always do as a first responder, hey, there's been an explosion nearby. And they said, we're getting a lot of calls, we don't know why. Your point to the fact that 911 systems were clogged. We are very aware of 9/11 and how all the phone systems were overwhelmed by that telephone traffic. No one thinks that every time that there's an event like that clean energy explosion, that the entire region has a 911 system that's overwhelmed.
Right.
And to that point, obviously a forward leaner in terms of using the internet to disseminate the information available in town. And now in disseminating to your community as a selectman, tell me something you mentioned before about radio systems and how you're now leaning forward, once again, leading the state of Connecticut in the little town of Durham in making communications more effective.
So when you do host an event like the Durham Fair, you need to make sure that your public safety system, and it is a system as you know, is robust to handle 250,000 people over a 3-day weekend.
How big is the town again?
7,400.
So you've multiplied the town by, I don't even know the exponent.
That's right. So early on, we had very forward thinking people build out a communication system. A few gentlemen in particular that were really responsible to connect the towers and our radios, et cetera, et cetera. And so 20 years later, we are past the lifespan of a lot of that equipment. And we just recently approved signing a memorandum of understanding with the state of Connecticut to join their public safety trunk system so that we will not have to do some of that infrastructure improvement, simply upgrade our radios. And it's still going to be a big nut, but it's not only important for our day-to-day, but it's very important when we host the Durham Fair to be able to provide the public safety that we do for that event.
And again, the state, as it's regrown, its foliage is vulnerable to windstorms and nor'easters.
Absolutely.
And I know Durham, I know where I live in Guilford and all along the shoreline, has to be ready for those ice storms and windstorms.
Right, and what this system's going to allow us to do is not only talk to our mutual aid partners, but our regional partners. I'm also the chair of our Region 2 emergency planning team. And so what we've done is we've built out all these special teams, whether it's a hazmat team or or a bomb squad or something like that. Every town doesn't need to have those special forces and resources. So now we can get on this radio, because now we're part of this bigger network, and communicate to not only our mutual aid partners, but the whole region, and look out for to get those resources.
Well, I'm betting you will have surprised our whole region's viewership by what you just said, because here's this tiny community of Durham, and I want you to describe what Region 2 represents in the state of Connecticut, that you are the chair of that planning, which is a critical part of emergency response. Planning is the key.
So when the Department of Homeland Security was started, that came with resources to our state. And we have 5 regions in our state. Our region is Region 2. It's comprised of 30 towns, from all the way to Woodbridge and Bethany, that area, all the way down to Deep River and all the shoreline in between. And so what the team does is it manages the money that comes in. And at one point, it was quite a bit of money, into the millions. We're down to much, much, much less than that right now. But it's okay, because we've already amassed a lot of resources that we share with one another. You mentioned you are a firefighter. The region owns a burn trailer that can travel around the region to help train our firefighters all over the place. And it provides resources that we not nearly could afford on our own. And it's not just the resources, physical resources. It's also, sharing experiences. What I have learned by sitting in those meetings from fire chiefs and emergency management directors and policemen and firefighters is just amazing. So.
And is New Haven a part of that region?
New Haven is part of that, a big player, and very generous with their resources.
Well, I wanted folks to know, it reflects closely Rosa DeLaura's district, congressional district.
Yeah, and we are in region District 3.
So we are looking at big cities like New Haven, like Middlesex, or Middletown rather, and communities, shorelines, tourist-based, Old Saybrook and Westbrook, where we shoot. All of them with different needs, resources, just in the emergency response field of medical, law enforcement, fire, and volunteer, career, the complexity of communicating each with another, the 9/11 problem of police and fire just communicating with one another, and then add in these other components. The fact that the Durham First Selectwoman is chair of that should tell volumes to your electorate how much you're respected within this region, because you don't get placed in those because no one else raised their hand. Often in bureaucracies that's the case, not with this. This is a huge burden, responsibility, and honor in the way I see things, for them to respect you enough to say you're the person that should chair that. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, but I can assure you that I get more than I give. One of the major accomplishments that we did over the past few years is we did a huge multidisciplinary and that included the entire region mass casualty drill on the Durham Fairgrounds. We started with the tabletop, and then it expanded into a full-blown exercise with blood, with animals, with real patients, real fake patients that were transported to Middlesex Hospital, with the scenarios of the hospital getting overwhelmed and who do we then divert to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bringing resource like that into Durham and involving our Durham Fair personnel was amazing.
Well, and you speak to this 250,000 people that land in this tiny community. And I'm sure there were naysayers that say, oh, that'll never happen, why do we need that? And yet, the Anheuser-Busch distributorship, the lottery headquarters, and Sandy Hook, all in communities of similar size and scope, and none of their community leaders or emergency responders conceived of having to respond to those events. And so being prepared, the exigencies of an emergency involving livestock have their own field in the emergency response services. Pets, and caring for them in an emergency where people are sheltering. Responders and their families having separate quarters from the other sheltered, so that they're not constantly hounded with questions when they're trying to take a break from those duties. All of those things that you exercised.
Oh, sure, we did. And we have a wonderful a separate team that's part of our emergency management department called the Durham Animal Response Team. And they are so widely respected now that Valley Shore dispatches them to other communities, and they also work under the Connecticut Animal Response Team. And yes, after Katrina, we learned that people won't go into shelters unless there is provision for their pets. So our shelter is designed for that, and we didn't exercise it, we actually executed it. Wow. We had to open up our shelter twice in 2 of those named storms that we had, in rapid succession early in my, and we had everything from dogs, cats, birds, fish. And we did learn that if you keep a parakeet in close proximity to the dog, the parakeet will start to bark.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I never would have. I was expecting the cat and the parakeet. I'm visiting Tweety and Sylvester, and you have the parakeet barking. I like it.
But because of our, good volunteers on our animal response team who manage that part of our shelter, we were able to accommodate our residents' needs in that way.
And I can tell you, having had a horse in a pool in Fairfield, that Durham's reputation exceeds the region as well, because you were folks that we all reached out to. Enough about emergencies. There's other elements of Durham, like the library that was established 2 years after Benjamin Franklin started the first one in Philadelphia. And as a lover of books, I have just great joy walking into that building. And your resident state trooper, who's a great resource beyond just the emergency response. But you have this fair, and you have other things that go on in Durham that draw people to the community. Tell us about those.
So the Durham Fair is the largest agricultural fair, I want to say in the country, but definitely on the Eastern Seaboard, that is run solely by volunteers. We don't have any paid staff that operates it. And when all is said and done, it takes about 1,100 volunteers to put that event on. And I always say that and I tell my residents too, because sometimes you take things for granted when it's right in front of you, right? But I tell them how envious some of my colleagues are around the state to have an event that brings people together. In a time where we're all isolated behind social media and our computers, et cetera, this brings people out of their homes and gather. Because to put on a fair like that, it's an all-year endeavor.
And it defines your community for everyone else in the state and nation. And it is, according to Wikipedia, the biggest in the nation, so I can assure you that.
And this year we're celebrating our 100th fair.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
It started as at a Grange meeting. And people around the table said, you know what, we should put together a fair. And that was actually 102 years ago when it was first documented that there was going to be such a thing as the Durham Fair. and it was on the town green for a number of years.
Wow.
And then slowly it became an association, not just an adjunct of the Grange. And the association bought some property, and while they still use the town green for part of it, most of it is on 55 acres behind the green. And
that's enormous.
yeah, and
it includes rides and livestock and
so as much as our
pulls.
midway and carnival type attractions is fun for many people, and as much as our entertainment draws in a lot of patrons, it is really our commitment to agriculture that I think makes us very special. We make sure that the personal skills are still celebrated, whether you're canning or baking or growing vegetables. That's still all very celebrated, or whether you're sewing or needlecraft, quilting, that type of thing. And we have our animals. We have 3 barns that are full of animals, some that people have not an opportunity to see up close and personal.
Such as?
Llamas. And in the llama barn, we have a whole display of what the hair, the fur is used for.
The alpacas and
the
other.
alpacas,
Yeah.
and so we have people there spinning the fibers, and we have a bunch of demonstrations going on all year. I mean, all around the fair. We have a museum that has old equipment that is probably the biggest collection of farm equipment that you'll ever see.
And it's doe-centered, so
And it
anyone,
is
an Eric
doe-centered.
Sloan advocate that loves looking at the drawings of old buildings and tools is going to have someone explain how those are
Yeah,
used.
we have old hay balers outside working, old tractors working and being demonstrated. And these are all from people that live in Durham or around Durham. So we like to think that we're keeping, our heritage alive by putting this fair on every year.
And not just the agricultural aspect and the oxen pull and the tractor pull and the parades, but also the craftsmen and women who have booths. You had a booth representing a business, but there's a whole array, and I don't know if your Chamber of Commerce is deeply engaged in that piece of it, but I've seen an amazing spectrum of booths, and just talk about that.
And a lot of them are nonprofit entities. Some of them are firefighters, the Killingworth Fire Department's there, the Middlefield Fire Department, and to a large degree, that's their biggest fundraiser of the year. Mm-hmm. So I remember when I was president of the Women's Club, and I don't know, there might have been some grousing about how much work the Durham Fair booth was. We used to sell chili, and I said, guys, do you understand? We're making all of our money this very difficult, tough 3 days, but we would have to replace that with bake sales and car washes and all of that stuff that other civic organizations have to do.
And bringing 250,000 people to be potential customers. That's not an easy thing in Durham.
So the Durham Fair is actually quite generous to civic organizations by giving huge discounts to come in and man those booths and provide that fundraising opportunities. Not only that, to our faith-based community who also gets involved. So there's no better way for a community to come together than for something like that.
And when is that again?
The last full weekend in September, and this year is our 100th fair.
Can't miss it.
They already announced our entertainment for
say, if there's any scoops you wanna
Saturday
drop, feel
night.
free.
Big and Rich is coming.
Oh, great.
And usually we don't like to announce this early because we like to keep, but
Suspense.
They are so happy to be participating in our 100th fair that they announced it.
Oh, so you got it taken from under you. Well,
Yeah.
Big and Rich, thank you for giving us the scoop that the first select woman did not want to. Having said that, what else about Durham? We talked about the historic district before we started, and you were drawn to that community of all, and you knew Hampden and West Haven, but also the other 164 towns in Connecticut. What else do you want Not only your residents, but the whole region. to know.
Right. So, once I was grabbed by just the community feel of the town, I then just loved the beauty of the town, and that largely has to do with our historic district and our rolling hills and fields and farms and barns that are found in and around our community. And the town wanted to protect that and created a historic district. That's not easy to create. There are referendums involved, and because there are people literally who have to give up some property rights by being required to conform to some standards. So the community was wise enough to do that, to protect the houses, and we're very proud of that, and it largely defines who we are. And in that historic district, another thing other than being an agricultural community, we're also very strong in manufacturing. For many years, if you owned a metal box, it was made in Durham by one of 3 companies. Only one still exists, Durham Manufacturing. But even today, you might pick up a metal box or a metal container, and you'll see Durham Manufacturing's.
Well, lead in particular, and the Goodrich family made their wealth out of lead, and the names on that historic strip are ripped straight from the stage of Hamilton, because you've got Lyman and Baldwin, and there were half a dozen that I just went, I know these names. This is an amazing thing. And a couple of interesting things that I learned. The founder of the state of Texas, who wasn't technically born in Durham, his father Moses, who was the lead
Austin.
manufacturer, spawned Stephen, and Stephen went and started a little state down south of here. And
It's a beautiful home.
Yep.
And I happen to know it is for sale, so come on down to Durham.
I'm sure she'll be able to get you a tour.
Beautiful house, and there's a beautiful plaque in front of it describing it. But with that manufacturing, that did create a problem. Before there were environmental laws, there were certain manufacturers who used materials that got into the groundwater and created contamination. So we do have a designated Superfund site on our main street, which I wouldn't like to bring up were it not for it's cleaned up.
Right.
And in roughly 3 weeks, a shovel will be in the ground, bringing clean, safe drinking water into that area. And so that problem that is decades old will be solved.
Well, if there's some folks up in Michigan that might want to take you as their next mayor, because you accomplished it under your and previous administrations.
It took 10 years.
I know.
It took 10 solid years, and when I say solid, meaning at least one, if not more, conference calls with our partners at EPA, Department of Public Health, State of Connecticut, DEP, and the City of Middletown to come up with the solution, to cobble together the funding, to get the contractor in place, the approvals in place. Took almost a year to get through the approval process in Middletown, and those good people there, again, voluntarily chose to help a neighbor out and create a partnership.
Well, and to your point, I worked with Gina McCarthy when I was economic
Gina
development.
was
Exactly, in Guilford, and we were just looking at xenon systems for the rock pile there. And to be able to get someone who then went on to be EPA secretary in the Obama administration, having someone like Gina, who was a good Boston girl, a good Massachusetts girl, and just was a pragmatist. She looked at the problem and she fixed the problem if she could. And that was probably a good partner that you had when you started that travel, because I have to tell you, I was raised near Love Canal in Buffalo, and and in my community of Fairfield, there was an Exide battery site that is just being cleaned up. I understand your 10-year trial, and I am awestruck that you completed that in your administration. I think that's got to be something of pride.
I am proud of that for this reason, because too many people had to live in fear. Even though their water was filtered, they still lived in fear. It devalued property. It made it difficult for people to finance properties on Main Street. So for all those reasons, primarily for public health, I'm very pleased and grateful.
Flint, Michigan could probably learn a lesson from Durham, Connecticut, unexpectedly, but, and as you said, not something that you'd want to wave that banner probably 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but when it was originally created, it was not even consideration. So we have to keep in mind our current political and environmental awareness was not a function back then. Right. The other thing, along with creating Texas, you pretty much created Hawaii.
Oh yes.
Because you have founded the missionary. You're the birthplace of the missionary who, in 1838 of all times, went out to Hawaii. And I had a friend that graduated from Kamehameha, which is the Hawaiian only school. She was one of two haulis, the whites that were allowed to go each year. And what a remarkable and prescient thing for a small town in what was still pre-Civil War, post-Revolutionary War Connecticut, to send someone down to Hawaii and missionary to those islands. So it's a fascinating community, considering its size and its bucolic nature, to recognize it as the founding place of lead and manufacturing of metallurgy.
Well, I like to think of us as a small town that thinks big.
Well, and you are you're exemplar of that. You are.
Thank you.
From everything I've learned and heard about you, and now from you, you really do represent Durham quite well. Not only today's Durham, but its history. So we know about historic Main Street, and we know about the fair, and briefly about the library. You have a lot of living places and not a lot of tax base. And I mention that because you have this roughly 6 to 8% of your population that's senior, a lot of them living on their own, and 40-something% that have children. And I know online, I looked, and you have a trip to Ellis Island and Statue of Liberty planned for the 1st of June, and you have kids' functions that I remember going to my elementary school and playing knock hockey and getting an orange pop. So tell us about how you serve those younger and older residents, given that their property taxes are your foundation.
Well, we do it by working with our partners. So we have a wonderful regional school district with the town of Middlefield. And it's not the only thing we share. We share a transfer station. And when we look at anything, we look at ourselves as a whole community. So our Little League is Durham and Middlefield, and our soccer club is Durham and Middlefield, and many of our programming is done collectively. So that helps us do it. And the Durham Fair actually helps us do things intergenerationally. So if you're a member of the needlework department, it's likely that you're going to have maybe an 85-year-old member working alongside with a 20-year-old member.
Fantastic.
And again, another unique opportunity that not all towns have. We do rent a space for what we call an activity center, and we are able to partner with CRT to provide senior lunches. You know, we know that Durham doesn't exist on an island. We know that we cannot do everything ourselves. I have one person working in each department. I have one person managing our recreation departments. And so we often look for partnerships to do that. And that's the way that we provide our services. I was recently speaking with someone who suggested that I could probably reduce the mill rate if I regionalize more and share services more. And then I went down the list. We share a transfer station, we share a school district. We're part of a regional 911 call center. We were a regionalized probate office before the state mandated that they turn into regions. We look at things like health care for our employees. We are in a pool with our school district and with the town of Middlefield. We are, as you mentioned, a resident state trooper town, which I think is the best example of a regional resource. So we know in the town of Durham that we can't do that all on our own, and we often seek out those partnerships. And
to your credit, to point this out, you acknowledge this regional resident state trooper program, a tremendous resource, but for the taxpayers in your community, you don't get to control those negotiations or what those contracts represent. Those are done by the state.
That's right.
So you give up some autonomy and collectivize your resources at that cost.
And you know, some have argued that because of lack of local control, we should have our own police department. However, I counter that by saying with that local control comes a great deal of local responsibility and a great deal of local costs. So while we don't participate in the union negotiations, we do get the benefit of, if the resident state trooper is injured, they backfill. If the car crashes, we get a new one. So I think it really does balance out. Agreed. To our favor.
Agreed. I think it's important that the folks in your community and throughout the region hear that.
So that being said, the split of the cost of that trooper used to be a 70-30 split with the state of Connecticut. And I hope that's because they acknowledge that because the trooper is a state resource, he or she can be pulled, and often are, and that was supposed to balance it out. But slowly, we now have to pay for it 100%. And that is our argument, that we need to go back to a shared resource because, in fact, I don't have total control over his time.
And we had a conversation in a special edition of this show that spoke to the fact that you and your colleagues in our region in particular have a responsibility to your electorate, but to the region as well. And you have the ability to provide your resident troopers resources. Those are state assets. And it's one pool of money. As one of your colleagues said, it's, as we are finishing our taxes or maybe have them done and are looking at what we spend them on, we meaning federal, state, local, we understand, as we do in our own households, here's the money coming in, and here's the money going out. And whether it's going out to the state, to the local, to the Board of Education, which is probably 2/3 of your budget, there are limitations to which you can pare down a fairly fixed, between contract negotiations and mandates from state and federal. There are challenges that you face, and if they have ideas, they should come to you, and you make yourself eminently available to those kinds of questions of, what about this? Could you try that? Likelihood is that you've already tried it, or other agencies within your COG and COST and CCM network have, and that's why you go out of district to find out those answers, so that you don't reinvent wheels. You don't need to reinvent wheels. You have those cogs, as we said, in the machine that you locally represent, that the state representatives and senators and our federal representatives, all of whom, that's an ongoing conversation. They have less than 8 weeks to go in Hartford to figure out this new administration's policies. Those impacts on you will reverberate into the community.
Absolutely.
And so I have about a minute left. If there's anything you want to say to your constituents, to the Durham fairgoers, 250,000 strong, now's the chance.
Well, first I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, and that's the town of Durham. And I just welcome everyone to come to the fair. It's always the last full weekend of September. And I just would like to tell the wider community, please get involved in your local government. It's really one of the most rewarding things that you're ever going to do, whether it's serving on a board or a commission or volunteering in a greater way in serving as a volunteer EMT or a firefighter. I guarantee you will get more in return.
Well, that was spoken like the public servant for your lifetime that you are. Also a mother and proud grandmother. Astonishing as that will be, I wanted to wait till the end because nobody was going to believe me and they just turn it off. And a shout out to, what are your grandkids and kids'
Audrey
names?
and Beckett.
And
my daughter Jillian and her husband Alan, my son Eric and his fiancee Rachel, and my loving husband Bob.
So there it is. We're all a family here. I thank you for your family sacrifice for the town of Durham and for our region. Once again, all politics is local, so step in anywhere. The water's fine.